So for centuries now, historians and mythologists have basically just chuckled at this one very specific, very strange idea.
Right. The idea about Odin.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. The notion that the Norse god Odin was, actually a real person. I mean, the prevailing view has always been that ancient deities are just purely psychological, or maybe elemental.
Just made up to explain the weather.
Right. Like we imagine these early people sitting around a campfire looking up at terrifying thunderstorms or harsh winters and just inventing magical stories to cope with a world they didn't understand.
It's a very comforting way to view the past, honestly.
It is, because we put modern factual history in one nice little box and we put quaint magical mythology into another box. And, that keeps the past manageable for us. But there's a new stack of historical research that suggests those boxes might be completely artificial.
Oh, absolutely artificial.
We are exploring this shocking possibility today for you. The idea that Odin wasn't just a localized thunder god or some spooky fairy tale. He might actually be the compressed, fossilized memory of a very real, very desperate Eastern warrior king fleeing an apocalypse on horseback.
And when you cross that boundary from pure mythology into medieval Icelandic literature, the landscape just becomes incredibly difficult to navigate.
Yeah, gets messy.
Very messy. You are no longer dealing with simple campfire stories. You're dealing with highly structured, politically motivated texts that blend, ancestral memory with continental European scholarship.
Right, the stakes are way higher.
Exactly. And pulling apart the layers of these narratives, it sort of dissolves that boundary between historical fact and mythological storytelling. You begin to see that what we call myth is often just history that has survived the erosion of centuries by putting on this heavy narrative armor.
Welcome to the Woden Files.
It's great to be diving into this.
Our goal today is to investigate a massive, fascinating stack of research titled Snorri Was Not Guessing. And this document basically strips away all the magic, the talking ravens, the eight-legged horses of Norse mythology, to reveal this astonishing historical convergence.
It really is a convergence. It pulls from so many different disciplines.
It really does. We are diving into a mystery that bridges the ancient city of Troy, Roman imperial expansion, medieval geographic cartography, and a real-world, highly lethal Iranian steppe people known to history as the Alans.
So to really anchor this investigation, we have to start with the architect of the mythology as we know it today.
Right, the guy who actually wrote it down.
Yes. The 13th century Icelandic writer and politician, Snorri Sturluson. I mean, anyone who has ever read a comic book featuring Thor or watched a movie about Asgard has consumed Snorri's work.
He's basically the source code for all of it.
He is. He authored the Prose Edda, which is essentially the grand textbook of Norse mythology, and Heimskringla, which is this massive history of the Norwegian kings. But in these texts, Snorri makes a claim that has frustrated modern scholars for generations.
He made a very specific geographic claim.
He stated explicitly that the Æsir, the ruling pantheon of gods led by Odin, were actually human beings who migrated from Asia.
And the standard academic reaction to that claim for, the last 200 years has been complete and utter dismissal.
Oh yeah, laughed out of the room.
Scholars have just categorized it as medieval fan fiction. They even have a fancy label for it, right? Euhemerism.
Right, euhemerism.
The idea being that Christian writers were uncomfortable with their pagan ancestors worshiping false gods, so they simply invented this backstory. Like, oh, these gods were just ordinary, impressive human kings who were mistakenly worshipped after they died.
It's a very convenient way to sanitize a pagan past.
Exactly. You tune a demon or a false god into a prominent mayor, and suddenly it's totally acceptable to write about him in a polite Christian society.
And so the assumption was always that Snorri, sitting up there in the dark winters of Iceland, was just employing this trick to excuse his interest in old poems. The prevailing thought was that he fabricated the Asian origin story entirely out of thin air just to make his ancestors look like sophisticated classical figures.
But the research we're examining today in this deep dive completely dismantles that assumption, piece by piece.
It really does. It argues that Snorri's account contains the structural, geographic, and ethnographic truth of a massive historical migration.
But, before we can even evaluate whether his story of an Eastern migration is true, we have to establish why we should trust Snorri as a historian in the first place.
That's a crucial step.
Because the popular imagination often pictures medieval writers as these isolated monks scribbling away in freezing monasteries, completely cut off from the wider world, just making stuff up to pass the time.
And if Snorri was just an isolated guy guessing in the dark, we can throw the whole book out.
But that image of the isolated guessing monk could not be further from the truth when it comes to Snorri Sturluson. We have to understand the specific, highly elite pipeline of his education.
He wasn't exactly slumming it.
Not at all. From the age of 3, Snorri was fostered at an estate called Odin. And fostering was this common practice among the elite in medieval Iceland to build political alliances. But Odin was not just any farm.
Right, his foster father was John Lofson.
Exactly.
And John Lofson wasn't just some local magistrate. He was arguably the most powerful chieftain in all of 12th century Iceland. And his power wasn't just local, right? He was deeply integrated into continental politics.
Highly integrated. Through his mother's side, he was a direct descendant of the Norwegian royal house.
Which is a huge deal. Huge. And through his father's side, he was connected to Simondr Frodi, this almost legendary Icelandic scholar who had studied in France and brought immense continental learning back to the island. So Odin basically functioned as a cultural and educational epicenter.
So placing a 3-year-old Snorri into that environment meant he was just marinated in the mechanics of power from the moment he could speak.
Precisely. The curriculum at Odin was rigorous. He was educated in classical Latin learning, theology, native Icelandic traditions, the intricacies of the law, and perhaps most importantly for our discussion today, genealogy.
Yeah, let's talk about genealogy, because the modern concept of genealogy is usually treated as just a casual hobby.
Right, something you do on a weekend.
Exactly. People spit in a tube or click through census records on a Sunday afternoon to see if they have, like, a distant connection to a minor European aristocrat. But in Snorri's reality, genealogy was the absolute foundation of society.
It was everything.
It functioned as currency, land deeds, and political legitimacy all rolled into one. If you lived in medieval Iceland or Norway, tracing your bloodline to ancient revered founders wasn't a dinner party trick. It was the literal, legal mechanism that justified your right to rule.
It proved you owned specific tracts of land, and it secured your position in a heavily armed, highly litigious society.
And the primary vehicle for preserving this vital genealogical information was poetry, right?
Yes, specifically skaldic poetry. Snorri society relied on this highly complex, strictly metered verse to function as their legal archives.
Which is wild to think about today.
It is. These poems, recited by skalds, who were the professional poets attached to a king's court, they preserved names, they recorded the outcomes of specific battles, mapped out territorial claims, and remembered the unbroken chain of rulers.
I always look at Snorri's deployment of genealogy as functionally identical to the paperwork in a modern corporate hostile takeover.
That's a great way to frame it.
Because if a modern corporation wants to absorb a rival, they don't just walk into the building and declare themselves in charge. They need a trail of legal precedent, financial documentation, and structural ties that prove their legal right to assume control in front of a judge.
Right, you need the receipts.
Exactly. For Snorri and the Norwegian kings he served, ancestral ties were that required paperwork. They used deep genealogy to justify political dominance over rival factions.
And Snorri himself ascended to the position of law speaker of Iceland, which was the highest elected authority in their national assembly, the Althing. So he spent considerable time embedded within the Norwegian royal court. He accrued vast wealth.
He knew how the game was played.
He really did. When he sat down to write Heimskringla, he was not some starry-eyed storyteller. He was a highly educated, politically ruthless, medieval aristocrat utilizing analytical methods to secure the legitimacy of his patrons.
But, tracing the logic here, his deep political entanglement is exactly what makes me suspicious.
Sure, it raises a red flag.
Yeah. If I am an exceptionally talented writer, and my immense wealth, status, and literal physical safety rely on the approval of a Norwegian king who desperately needs a glorious ancestral resume to secure his throne.
You're going to give him what he wants.
Exactly. I am highly incentivized to invent the most majestic, unassailable fake history the world has ever seen. The political motivation seems like a primary reason to assume he fabricated the Asian origin story.
And that skepticism is entirely warranted. I mean, it formed the bedrock of scholarly dismissal for centuries. It is entirely possible that an intelligent writer could fabricate a grand narrative for political gain.
Yeah.
But the thesis of Snorri was not guessing, demonstrates that complete invention is actually the least economical explanation when you dissect the Icelandic historical pipeline. Snorri did not operate in a vacuum, and he did not conjure these traditions from nothing. He inherited a robust pre-existing framework.
Okay, let's examine that pipeline then. Because if Snorri is just the final editor of older material, we really need to know how reliable that older material actually is.
Well, Snorri explicitly outlines his methodology in the prologue to Heimskringla. He bases a massive portion of his history on that skaldic verse we mentioned earlier. And the rules of skaldic poetry, specifically the Drakfjord meter, were brutally complex.
Like almost impossible to fake on the fly.
Exactly. They involved strict internal rhyme, alliteration, and very specific syllable counts. This complexity meant the poems could not easily be altered or corrupted over time without completely ruining the meter.
The poem would basically break if you try to change a name.
Right. Furthermore, Snorri writes that he only treats poems composed and performed during a king's actual lifetime as valid historical witnesses.
Which really functions as a form of immediate real-time peer review.
Oh, absolutely.
If a skald stands up in a mead hall and recites a poem, claiming the king single-handedly slaughtered an army in a specific valley, and half the warriors in the room were at that battle, and no, it didn't happen that way.
The poet is going to have a very bad night.
Yeah, he'd be mocked or punished. The audience for the poem was the very group of people who witnessed the events.
Precisely. And beyond the strict structural preservation of the poetry, Snorri was building on the foundation of earlier Icelandic historians. Figures like Ari Sorgilsson, writing in the early 12th century, had already begun synthesizing native traditions.
So he had a paper trail of earlier historians.
He did. Snorri also likely utilized earlier, now lost works like the Skjaldunga saga, which integrated oral traditions, learned historical writing, and ancient poetry. The critical finding here is that the tradition of the Æsir coming from the east, that core memory of an Asian origin, was already embedded in the Icelandic historical consciousness well before Snorri was even born.
So he didn't invent the memory. The memory existed.
Yes. Snorri's monumental contribution was providing that ancient tribal memory with a continental, intellectually prestigious framework.
And this transition from native memory to continental framework is really where the whole story pivots. Because if Snorri possesses this inherited unshakable tradition that his ancestors, the Æsir, migrated from some unknown eastern homeland, he faces a massive communication problem.
He has to translate it for his audience.
Right. He cannot simply write, some guys wrote out of the East 1,000 years ago. He is writing for a deeply Christian 13th century European elite. He needs to translate pagan tribal memory into the recognized language of continental power. He needs a framing device that medieval Europe respects.
And he chooses the most powerful narrative device available to a medieval historian.
The Trojan War.
The Trojan War. The cultural gravity of Troy in the Middle Ages just cannot be overstated. Claiming descent from the survivors of Troy was the ultimate medieval status symbol.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate blue checkmark for a civilization.
That is exactly what it was. The Romans had famously claimed descent from the Trojan hero Aeneas, a narrative solidified by Virgil. The British laid claim to Trojan descent through a legendary figure named Brutus. The Franks had their own Trojan origin myths.
So if a nation wanted to be viewed as civilized, ancient, and legitimate, they tied their bloodline to the ashes of Troy. But if Snorri is going to use Troy to legitimize his Scandinavian ancestors, we have to figure out how he even knew about the intricacies of the Trojan War. I mean, Iceland is perched on the extreme periphery of the known medieval world. How is a 13th century Icelandic politician accessing Mediterranean Bronze Age traditions?
That's where the research by scholar Anthony Falks comes in. He's a leading authority on Snorri's Edda, and his work provides the answer.
What did he find?
Falks traced Snorri's knowledge of Troy not to Homer's Iliad, which was actually largely inaccessible in Western Europe at the time, but to an Icelandic text called Trojamanna saga.
Okay.
This saga was a direct translation of Latin sources that were circulating widely in Europe, most notably a text attributed to a writer known as Dares the Phrygian.
And Dares the Phrygian is such a fascinating literary artifact. It was presented to the medieval world as a literal, first-hand, eyewitness diary of the Trojan War.
Like a war correspondent.
Exactly. It purported to be written by a combatant who actually fought on the side of the Trojans. And medieval scholars heavily preferred Dares over Homer because Dares stripped away the pagan gods, the magic, and the supernatural interventions. He presented a gritty, ground-level military history. It felt real.
Because it felt like a sober historical document, it was treated as absolute fact. Now, the research gets really forensic here. When modern scholars combed through the text of Dares the Phrygian and other related Trojan materials to figure out exactly what Snorri was reading, they found something incredibly illuminating.
They did not find the name Odin, right?
No, they did not find Odin, they did not find Woden, they did not find the word Æsir.
Which, frankly, is a relief.
Why is that a relief?
Well, if researchers suddenly claimed to find the exact Norse god Odin just sitting in the middle of a Latin text about the Trojan War, it would scream of forgery. We would immediately assume a later scribe just jammed the name in there to force the puzzle pieces together. So the absence of Odin actually proves the text hasn't been tampered with to serve a modern theory.
That's a very good point. But the absence of Odin does not mean an absence of relevant material. What researchers did find when analyzing the Dares tradition was a massive, undeniable concentration of names operating in the Phrygian and Trojan theater that sound remarkably familiar.
Okay, lay them out for us.
Well, Dares goes to great lengths to contrast the forces of Europe with the forces of Asia. And within his Asian theater, he documents a Phrygian military commander named Asius.
Asius?
He documents another figure named Ascanius, who hails from a geographical region called Ascania. He lists a prominent leader named Odius.
Wow.
And even looking back to the broader Trojan tradition, Homer places a figure named Assaracos directly into the royal genealogy of Troy, positioned as a direct ancestor of Aeneas.
Wait. If Dares the Phrygian already had commanders named Asius and Odius operating in an Eastern theater designated as Asia, then modern scholarship has been incredibly unfair to Snorri.
How?
Because for centuries, academics accused Snorri of fabricating this linguistic connection, of just wildly making up names to force a link between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean. But he wasn't doing that at all. He was actually doing rigorous, faithful medieval citation. He was reading his sources accurately.
Yes, he was utilizing the absolute best historical data available to him. Now, obviously, none of these individual figures in the Trojan texts are literally the Norse gods.
Right.
Odius, the Trojan commander, is not Odin the Allfather. Assaracos is not some lost Scandinavian deity. But taken as an aggregate, they demonstrate that the Latin source world Snorri was studying already contained this dense cluster of as and Odi sounding names attached to elite Eastern leaders.
The psychological process of reading that text must have been electrifying for him. I mean, think about it. Snorri comes to his desk with an unshakable inherited oral tradition that insists his divine ancestors, the Æsir, led by a man whose name sounds like Odin, migrated from a homeland in Asia. He opens a highly respected, translated Latin manuscript detailing the most famous ancient war in Asia, and he immediately encounters leaders named Asius, Odius, and Ascanius. To a medieval mind, operating on the logic of etymology and name resemblance, this isn't a coincidence. It is absolute confirmation. Snorri must have felt like he had discovered the smoking gun of his own people's history hidden in the Roman archives.
Exactly. It provided the perfect architectural scaffolding. The Trojan narrative offered a prestigious ancient dynasty in King Priam. It offered a detailed royal genealogy that he could connect directly to his own kings.
It legitimized everything.
Above all, it provided a universally understood, globally respected blueprint for migration. Across medieval Europe, the accepted model of civilization building was that an ancient elite people survive a cataclysmic war, they migrate across the continent, they found new nations, and they seed the bloodlines of modern royalty.
So Snorri simply took his native, authentic northern memory of an eastern migration and draped it over the prestigious mannequin of Troy.
That is exactly what he did.
It makes complete sense that Troy provided the names and the prestige. But, Troy is situated in the Mediterranean in modern-day Turkey. When Snorri maps out the migration of Odin, he doesn't place Odin's homeland in the Mediterranean.
No, he places it much further north.
Right, he places far to the north in the freezing steppes of Russia. So the Trojan text couldn't have helped him with the geography. If Snorri is accurately plotting a map of the Russian steppes and the Black Sea, where did a 13th century Icelander get that geographical data?
This requires us to further dismantle that myth of Icelandic isolation. 12th and 13th century Iceland was a hub of intense intellectual translation. To map out Odin's world, Snorri relied heavily on Roman history and medieval cartography.
What specific texts are we talking about?
We know of a compilation text called Rom-Verja Saga, which was a sprawling Icelandic history of Rome. This wasn't just some superficial summary. It was assembled from direct translations of heavy Roman literature, specifically Sallust's histories of the Jugurthine War and the Catiline Conspiracy. And crucially, it also included translations of Lucan's massive epic poem, the Pharsalia,
The Pharsalia is an incredibly dense, complex poem detailing the apocalyptic Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. The idea that Icelandic scholars in the 1100s were translating the brutal geopolitics of the Roman Republic into Old Norse is staggering.
It really is. It completely recalibrates our understanding of their intellectual reach.
But how does the Roman Civil War translate into a map of the Russian steppes? That's what I'm stuck on.
Well, the Pharsalia deeply details Pompey the Great's military campaigns in the east. This brought massive amounts of geographical and political information about the eastern frontier into the Norse language.
Oh, I see.
The Arni Magnusson Institute in Iceland actually dates these translations to shortly after the middle of the 12th century. That is decades before Snorri reached his intellectual maturity. So the history of Roman imperial expansion, the shifting borders of the East, and the specific geography of the Black Sea region were all readily available to Snorri in his native tongue.
Which explains the highly specific map he draws at the very beginning of Ynglinga Saga. Because when Snorri sets the stage for Odin's history, he describes a world neatly divided by the Black Sea and a massive waterway he calls the river Tanais.
Right, the Tanais.
In modern geography, the Tanais is the Don River, flowing through Russia into the Sea of Azov. In ancient and medieval cartography, the Tanais was the universally accepted dividing line separating the continent of Europe from the continent of Asia. And Snorri explicitly places Asland, or Asaheim, the great capital city and homeland of the Æsir just east of the Tanais River.
Yes. Snorri anchors Odin's headquarters precisely east of the Don River, north of the Caucasus Mountains in the Pontic-Caspian steppe.
That is highly specific.
It is. This geographical precision was heavily informed by translated encyclopedic texts like the Elucidarius, which was a popular medieval textbook on theology and geography, and the Veraldar Saga, a universal history.
So he had all the tools.
Snorri possessed the sophisticated map language required to take a nebulous oral tradition of an Eastern homeland and plot it with, GPS-like medieval coordinates onto the physical geography of the continent.
Okay, so knowing where they lived solves the map problem, but it creates a narrative problem.
How so?
Well, if Odin is a phenomenally successful war chief living in a secure, fortified capital east of the Don River, why does he leave? What is the narrative trigger that forces an entire civilization to pack up their wagons and horses and march into the unknown forests of northern Europe?
Well, Snorri provides a very specific geopolitical motivation for that. He writes that Odin, despite his military brilliance, possessed foresight to see that powerful external forces were beginning to subjugate the known world.
Who was coming for them?
Specifically, Snorri claims Odin fled his homeland because of the relentless, expanding political pressure of the Roman Empire. The Romans were systematically swallowing up independent kingdoms, and Odin chose to take his people and migrate westward to preserve their autonomy and establish a new power base far from the Roman legions.
I interpret this Roman motivation similarly to how a modern historical novelist operates.
What do you mean by that?
Imagine a writer tasked with penning a novel based on a vague family legend that their great-grandparents had to suddenly flee Eastern Europe in the late 1930s. The writer doesn't have the specific localized detail of why they left on a Tuesday in October.
Right, the granular details are lost.
So the writer uses the looming shadow of World War II and the expansion of the Axis powers as the backdrop. It is the massive, world-altering geopolitical event of that era that perfectly explains mass migration.
That makes a lot of sense.
Even if the family actually fled a localized pogrom or a specific economic collapse 3 years earlier, the famous, well-documented macro conflict becomes the narrative engine. Snorri knows his ancestors fled the east. He knows from reading the Römverja saga that Rome was the unstoppable conquering machine of antiquity, so he naturally synthesizes the two.
That is the exact mechanism of medieval historical synthesis. Snorri is taking the general unyielding shape of an inherited memory and painting it with the historical colors he has available on his palette.
The Roman sagas provided the vocabulary of imperial displacement.
Exactly. However, if we peel back Snorri's assumption about Roman expansion and look objectively at the actual history of the region east of the Tanais River during antiquity, we encounter a reality that just shatters the idea that Snorri was making this up.
This is where the investigation stops being a literary critique and becomes a startling historical convergence. We have the Trojan names for prestige, we have Roman geography for the map, but who was actually living east of the Don River? If we take away the magic and look at the dirt, who occupied Asland?
The historical record is definitive on this, and it points directly to an Iranian steppe people known as the Alans.
The Alans.
The Alans are the missing piece of the puzzle, and they are not mythological. They were a thoroughly documented, physically real, highly influential confederation of Iranian-speaking nomads. Geographically, classical and medieval sources place them precisely in the North Pontic, Caspian, and Caucasian steppe environment.
Which is exactly where Snorri placed them.
They lived exactly where Snorri placed the homeland of the Æsir, east of the Tanais River.
Now, if I am looking at ancient Roman and Chinese sources describing the Alans, they aren't described as settling down, building stone castles, and farming wheat. They're described as nomadic pastoralists, and more importantly, as terrifyingly effective heavy cavalry.
Oh, they were masters of warfare?
They bred massive war horses and fought as armored lancers, serving as mercenaries and allies across the ancient world. But how does a nomadic group of cavalry fighters map onto the Æsir?
To understand the connection, we really have to look at how the rest of the world referred to the Alans. They did not only call themselves Alans, the historical nomenclature surrounding this group is incredibly dense and highly specific.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, the Encyclopedia Iranica documents ancient related groups in the same geographical sphere known as the Æsir. And as we track travelers and historians through the Middle Ages, the naming conventions become virtually undeniable.
Let's trace those names because this linguistic evidence is overwhelming to me.
All right, in the 13th century, a Franciscan monk named William of Rubruck traveled extensively through the Mongol Empire and the steppes. In his official Latin reports, he referred to the people of this region as Alani Siv Asus. Translated, that is literally the Alan, or Asises.
Wow.
Another prominent medieval traveler and diplomat, Plano Carpini, documented them as the Alani Siv Asi.
The Asi, that is not a vague resemblance. That is a direct phonetic match.
And the documentation continues across different cultures. Russian chronicles referred to these steppe cavalrymen as the Yas. As segments of the Alanic population migrated westward and settled in Hungary, their descendants became known as the Jaz.
It just keeps showing up.
It does. In the Georgian language, the root name produced os, or offs, which survives directly into the modern era as the name for the Ossetian people, who are the linguistic descendants of the Alans living in the Caucasus today.
So the historical everyday ethnonym used by neighbors and diplomats for the Alans was the Az, or the Asi. And these Az people lived exactly where Snorri claimed the Æsir lived.
Exactly.
Snorri writes about the Æsir from Aslan. The historical record documents the Az from the Alanic steppes. You cannot dismiss a direct historical ethnonym occupying the exact correct geographical coordinates as a lucky guess.
You really can't.
But the alignment goes even deeper than just a name on a map. It extends to how their society was actually built.
Yes, when you read Snorri's description of Odin in Ynglinga Saga, he is not describing an ethereal sky god throwing lightning bolts from the clouds. He describes Odin as a flesh and blood, highly strategic military chieftain.
Like a real warlord.
Right. Odin operates from a fortified center, but he does not stay there. He surrounds himself with a council of 12 leading priests or judges who administer the law. Odin is constantly traveling, forging alliances, conquering neighboring kingdoms, and commanding a highly mobile, elite military force.
And that structural description is a perfect mirror of how nomadic cavalry confederacies operated. The Alans were not a stationary, bureaucratic nation-state with rigid borders and a permanent capital city.
No, they were much more fluid.
Right. They were organized into highly mobile political and military coalitions. Their leaders commanded elite units of heavy cavalry that routinely crossed political boundaries. They served as kingmakers for the Roman Empire, the Parthians, and the Sasanian Persians.
They were political operators as much as warriors.
They absorbed smaller tribes and forged alliances through martial dominance. The model Snorri describes, a traveling war band establishing authority over mixed populations, is the exact socio-political structure of the Alanic elite.
It really is a one-to-one structural match. However, translating a massive, complex, centuries-long confederation of nomadic warriors into the mythology of a single pantheon of gods requires a specific psychological mechanism.
And this is exactly what I struggle with. Even with all the geographical and linguistic matches, we are talking about thousands of people, dozens of warlords, and centuries of complex geopolitical maneuvering. How does a massive society of mobile cavalry get remembered by later generations as just one guy? How do the complex historical realities of the Alans simply become the myth of Odin?
The mechanism responsible for that transformation is a well-documented phenomenon in oral history known as founder memory or historical compression.
Historical compression.
Yes. When a society relies entirely on oral tradition rather than written archives, human memory simply cannot sustain the intricate details of centuries of geopolitics. Over generations, memory degrades and compresses.
It's the floating gap of oral history. You remember your parents and your grandparents and maybe a few great-grandparents. But beyond 80 or 100 years, the specific names of minor kings, the exact dates of treaties, and the complicated border disputes just fade into a generalized cultural memory.
Exactly. What survives the floating gap are the grand, traumatic, or triumphant events, and they survive by being attached to a single monolithic figure.
Can you give an example?
Think of how the historical realities of post-Roman Britain, dozens of minor warlords fighting desperate skirmishes against Saxon invaders over hundreds of years, eventually compressed into the singular, shining mythology of King Arthur.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Arthur becomes the avatar for an entire era of resistance.
Precisely. The same compression happens with the Alans. You have a highly successful ruling house, a sacred title passed down among leaders, and a massive, traumatic military migration involving multiple chiefs in several generations.
And over time, it all just collapses.
Right. Over 5 or 6 centuries of oral retelling in the mead halls of Scandinavia, all of that agonizing complexity collapses. The successful leaders, the sacred titles, a whole movement, it all compresses into the memory of a single legendary founder.
So when we talk about Odin, we aren't talking about a literal single individual who lived for 300 years and single-handedly fought his way from Russia to Sweden.
No, certainly not.
Odin is the compressed avatar of an entire ruling dynasty and their collective military achievements. The historical nuances, the specific ethnic labels, the varying dialects, the forgotten alliances, they fade away as the group intermarries and assimilates into new Northern European cultures. What remains is the supreme ancestor.
And Snorri is recording the end result of that founder memory compression. He received the compressed diamond of oral history and set it into the metalwork of medieval scholarship.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
But to fully validate this theory, we must return to the narrative trigger we mentioned earlier. We established that Snorri used Roman expansion as a convenient historical novelist explanation for why his ancestors fled Assaland.
Right.
But if Roman legions weren't actually pushing the Alans out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, what was the real apocalypse that drove them westward?
Because something had to. What forces a society of heavily armed, terrifyingly effective cavalry warriors to abandon their ancestral homeland and run for their lives?
The historical record points to an event much more sudden and devastating than Roman border skirmishes. It was the Hunnic shock of the late 4th century.
The Huns. We are talking about the ancestors of Attila emerging from the deep Eurasian steppe.
Yes. Around 375 AD, the Huns swept out of the east with unprecedented ferocity and completely overran the Hellenic territories north of the Black Sea.
Just completely wiped the board clean.
It was not a localized political dispute, it was a continental cataclysm. The Huns utilized new tactics of mounted archery and psychological warfare that shattered the existing power structures of the steppe. The invasion caused a massive, violent population realignment that triggered the migration period across late antiquity.
The geopolitical domino effect of the Huns is staggering to think about. They hit the Alans hit the Goths hit the Roman border, and the Western world changes forever. But what happened specifically to the Alans when the Huns destroyed their homeland?
Well, the Hellenic Confederation splintered. Some groups were conquered, subjugated, and absorbed into the Hunnic war machine, actually riding alongside them in later campaigns.
But not all of them.
No. Substantial factions of the Alans refused subjugation. They were driven westward, fleeing ahead of the Hunnic advance.
But they can't just gallop westward into a void. Europe in the late 4th and early 5th centuries is densely populated. They had to navigate through territories already occupied by other fiercely territorial groups.
And this is where the historical reality perfectly mirrors Snorri's structural blueprint. As the fleeing Alans moved westward, they did not fight everyone they encountered. They formed massive, desperate survival coalitions.
Who do they team up with?
The historical Alans moved directly into territories occupied by Germanic peoples. They formed a massive confederation with Germanic tribes, most notably the Vandals and the Suebi.
Wow.
Together, this mixed, multi-ethnic army of Iranian cavalry and Germanic infantry crossed the frozen Rhine River on the last day of the year 406 AD, pouring into Roman Gaul.
That sounds like a movie scene.
It really was. From there, they carved a path of destruction and settlement through France into Spain and eventually established a joint kingdom in North Africa. Other factions of Alans entered directly into Roman military service or formed smaller mixed kingdoms settling across Gaul and Italy.
Now let's look back at the text Snorri actually wrote in Ynglinga Saga, because he states that Odin, feeling the pressure of a great conquering force, gathers his people and travels westward from the Tanais River. He passes through the Russian lands, and where is his primary destination?
He goes to Saxland.
Yes. He reaches a region Snorri calls Saxland, which is the Old Norse term for Germanic territory. And what does Odin do in Saxland? He doesn't wipe them out. He establishes his sons as rulers over the territory, he intermarries his elite bloodline with the local leaders, and his descendants become the royal houses of the Germanic and Scandinavian North.
The convergence between the myth and the history is absolute. Historically, the westward fleeing Alans became deeply, inextricably embedded within the political and military structures of the Germanic world.
They became part of them.
They served in joint armies, their elite cavalry commanders married into Germanic ruling houses, and over the centuries, their distinct Iranian identity blended with the cultures of their Germanic allies until the original Alanic label basically disappeared into the new political formations of post-Roman Europe.
The structural accuracy is flawless. I mean, Snorri got the cause of the migration wrong. He blamed the Romans instead of the Huns, which is entirely logical because his library was full of Roman history, not Hunnic chronicles.
Right, he was working with what he had.
But the actual architectural blueprint of the event is perfectly preserved. An Eastern warrior elite, documented historically as the Æsir, is displaced from the Pontic steppe by a massive, unstoppable conquering force. They migrate violently westward. They embed themselves politically, militarily, and genetically into the Germanic world. They install themselves as rulers, they intermarry, and they survive the apocalypse under transformed identities. Snorri's mythological account is an exact structural match for the historical reality of late antiquity.
And to suggest that this is merely a coincidence requires a suspension of disbelief far greater than accepting the historical reality. The author of the research report we are reviewing today frames this argument perfectly. To reject any historical relationship here, to insist that Snorri's account is a 100% pure medieval fiction generated from a vacuum, demands that we accept a sequence of accidents that borders on the absurd.
We really need to clearly tally up the sheer volume of these coincidences, because when you lay them out sequentially, the burden of dismissing them becomes mathematically impossible.
Let's do it. We begin with geography. Snorri accidentally placed the mythological homeland of his gods, Æsir, just east of the Tanais River, which, coincidentally, is the exact documented territory of the historical Alans.
Then we have the linguistic match. The historical inhabitants of that specific territory were coincidentally known by their neighbors, diplomats, and enemies by the exact same name, the Ass or the Æsir.
Structurally, Snorri accidentally described his ruling gods not as abstract spirits, but as a highly mobile, traveling warrior elite commanded by a traveling chieftain. Coincidentally, the historical Alans were universally renowned across the ancient world as mobile professional warriors and elite cavalry confederacies.
Snorri claims this ruling group was violently displaced from their homeland during an era of massive, unstoppable imperial conquest. Coincidentally, the historical Alans were violently displaced during the great 4th century collapse of the steppe frontier, driven out by the overwhelming force of the Huns.
Snorri accidentally wrote that his displaced Easterners moved directly westward and embedded themselves in Saxland, forming deep alliances with Germanic peoples. Coincidentally, the historical Alans moved westward in massive survival coalitions, specifically allied with Germanic tribes, like the Vandals and the Suebi.
Snorri's Odin coincidentally established sons and dynasties along that Germanic route, intermarrying with local royalty. Coincidentally, Alan elites entered post-Roman political systems, formed military settlements, married into European royalty, and created mixed kingdoms across the continent.
And finally, Snorri coincidentally had access to translated Roman texts that gave him the perfect language of imperial expansion to explain the displacement, and he coincidentally had access to translated Trojan texts filled with commanders named Æsir and Odius that provided the perfect, universally respected framing device to legitimize this entire narrative for a skeptical medieval audience.
When you look at the totality of that list, it stops being rigorous, scholarly skepticism to dismiss it. It becomes an active refusal to look at the evidence. If a scholar insists on treating every single one of those structural, geographic, and linguistic convergences as a completely separate, unrelated, happy accident, they are intentionally putting blinders on. The coincidences do not dissipate when subjected to closer scrutiny. They multiply and reinforce one another.
Which brings us to the solidified thesis of Snorri was not guessing. The conclusion is not that Snorri possessed a perfectly accurate chronological biography of a specific Atlantic king.
Right, it's not a direct one-to-one diary.
Exactly. We are not arguing that Odin was a literal man named Bob the Allen who rode a specific horse from the Black Sea to Sweden in the year 380 AD.
That would be a stretch.
It would be. The thesis is that Snorri Sturluson preserved an authentic, inherited northern memory of an elite migration. This deep cultural memory absorbed the historical trauma, the military triumphs, and the eventual assimilation of the Hellenic people. Over centuries of oral retelling across the floating gap of memory, that history was compressed into the mythological figure of Odin.
And when Snorri finally committed it to parchment, he expertly mapped that ancient trauma onto the framework of medieval geography and classical literature.
Precisely.
History was quite literally forged into mythology. The immigrant cavalry leader, the native thunder gods, the desperate war band, and the conquering dynasty all melted together in the crucible of time until they became completely indistinguishable from one another. It transforms how we must read these ancient texts. They aren't just fantasy novels written by confused monks.
No, they are survival documents. They are the mechanisms by which a people ensured their history outlasted the collapse of their civilization.
And connecting this massive historical revelation back to you, the listener, what does this fundamentally change about how we view the past? The stories that we have relegated to the nursery, the bedtime myths, the comic book lore, the ancient superstitions about one-eyed gods and magical ravens, they might actually be the compressed, fossilized remains of real desperate ancient refugees.
It's an incredible shift in perspective.
They are the echoes of brilliant warrior coalitions surviving the absolute apocalypse of their era. The mythology of Odin is not a monument to medieval ignorance. It is a monument to a very real human struggle for survival, dominance, and legacy in a world that was collapsing around them.
It serves as a profound reminder that our ancestors were not simply inventing fairy tales out of boredom or a lack of scientific understanding. They were desperately trying to preserve their truth, their origins, and their legal right to exist, utilizing the most advanced storytelling technologies available to them.
Which was strict metered poetry and genealogical recitation.
Exactly, and eventually the sweeping narratives of the sagas.
Which leaves me with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to carry with you after this deep dive. It's a massive, complex historical reality. A Eurasian cavalry coalition involving brutal wars, displaced refugees, shifting borders, political collapse, and centuries of cultural assimilation could be systematically compressed over 800 years into the simplified magical myth of a single one-eyed god wandering the earth with a spear.
It really makes you wonder.
It does. What highly complex, multi-layered historical events from our recent history will undergo that exact same compression 800 years from now? When the agonizing intricacies of our world wars, the nuances of our technological revolutions, and the messy realities of our geopolitical collapses fade across the floating gap of future memory and devolve into the oral traditions of a distant era.
Who will be our Odin?
Exactly. Who will be our Odin? It forces us to confront the reality that history is never static. It is always actively in the process of becoming myth.
Very true.
To follow the investigation, visit woodensman.com.